So this is the framework that we're going to talk through, and there's a couple of slides to sort of explain this. And this is, as I said, this is our sort of moving it from the strict data to try and put it into some coherent structure. So the Vision 2040, Reinventing Sustainability, again, that's in the middle. And around that are what we call 7 key strategic pillars. And I'll explain how they got built up, and that's also in the report. And you'll notice that a lot of our diagrams, what we try and do is talk about a systems type approach. And I think that's really important to understand because, you know, if you think about the big issues that were identified early on, things like workforce housing, workforce availability, transportation issues, congestion issues, they're all really interrelated. So you have to take a kind of an organic or interrelated approach to think about how do you tackle these things, because obviously, you know, a large inbound commuter workforce is part of your congestion issue and so on, right? Or the lack of available affordable housing, you know, creates that because people are ending up having to locate, you know, some distance from the, and so this is what this tries to tackle. And I'll start at the top and go around, and I'm trying to indicate that these strategic pillars, if you get it right, can be sort of reinforcing. So you're trying to create a sort of a synergistic sort of an effect where investment in one area supports or mobilises investment in other areas and activity and so on. I'm not saying it's the perfect model, and I'm not trying to say it's linear, right? But I am saying these things are, you know, connected and they do impact each other. So I'll start at the top, right? So the relentless pursuit of excellence, and that's what we're proposing as a strategic pillar. And it's really interesting sort of a concept, I think, and what emerged for us in terms of standing in front of literally, you know, 1,000+ people on this community and having really quite important conversations is that the sense is that people are not satisfied that Hilton Head Island's merely good. People want it to be great, or to be extraordinary or exceptional. You know, many people here came here because of, you know, a very renowned brand. And I think as a contextual behaviour, we're sort of proposing that as a strategic pillar because I think that's going to define how you might resolve some of the tough issues going forward. It's also a thread, actually, because we've been looking at what's the threads. It's a thread that really goes back over decades to both some of the founding concepts of the modern era of development. It's in previous visionary sort of documents in one form or another. But I think calling this out and thinking about how do we function at the level of excellence is important. And I don't just mean a nice coat of paint. You know, I'm talking about as a community that you have a focus on doing things as good as you can. You know, and I want to address later on, and I'll kind of weave this in now, but I think there are some sort of behaviours in the fabric of this community where it's a bit destructive, right? You know, it's like in terms of people pretty challenging about sort of decision making, and there's sort of like a tendency to go after each other a little bit. That to me is not a pursuit of excellence. That'll run you down to the lowest common denominator. You know, and the vision that is being articulated is going to require excellence in almost every dimension, if not every dimension. So it's just, we're going to peg that out there as sort of an overarching philosophy. The next two strategic pillars moving around, the next three really are built directly from the scenario matrix. So one is about redefining environmental sustainability. And right in the middle, of course, is the name of the preferred future, Reinventing Sustainability again. There's that scenario, and the details about that are in the reports. But it's arguable that there was probably a very strong reputation for sustainability in this community. Okay, the Charles Fraser dream or vision, you know, the ecological landscape protection, so on, that's been a very founding value. But as we discussed at the community engagement sessions, you probably would have difficulty claiming that Hilton Head Island is at the very forefront of sustainability today. If you think about it in terms of all the other dimensions of sustainability, you know, energy management, water systems, ecological health, you know, I see you've just recently banned plastic bags, right? But that's really like the tip of the story, right? So if we're going to be really making a mark for ourselves about sustainability, then I think there's going to be a requirement for us not to kid ourselves, but to really say we need to redefine what does sustainability mean to us, and broaden that focus and that lens to really think about all those issues about transportation, modes of transportation, carbon footprint impacts, some of those kind of bigger issues. So that's sort of a key strategic pillar. Otherwise, I pretty much would predict this, and I think I can say this as I'm delivering the consultant's report, is you're living off the investment that occurred before. You're living off the investment and the vision of something that was founded decades and decades ago, right? And if you're serious about reinventing sustainability again, I think you better than any community can recapture that and be the type of community that leads the story into the future about what does sustainability mean in a community in today's world in 2020, 2030 and 2040, okay? But there's all sorts of implications that come with that, right? Which is, start with the simple stuff, plastic bags, straws and all those things, but then there's a whole raft of things there to be really thinking about. There's issues about community sustainability and the future of the Gullah Geechee culture and things like that, and we touch on that in the vision report. So the bigger picture redefines environmental sustainability, but really what we're talking about is sustainability there. The next strategic pillar is about revitalising and modernising the economy. That's the vertical axis. That is something that is just fundamental to being able to achieve the preferred future, because it's one of the two big defining axes. There's an enormous world in that whole story, in terms of thinking about how do you trigger the next wave of economic development. And it's in a context where your history over decades has been based on growth. Development growth, tourism growth, population growth. But the early work that we did, the survey work, and it was reinforced through it, there's little appetite expressed by the community about continued trajectory of population and development growth. Okay, so you're smart enough to know that if you don't then think about, you're going to get into a stagnation situation if we don't think about how do we, maybe, there's the aspiration that we're not going to just keep maxing out and end up with, whatever, millions of tourists and hundreds of thousands of people or whatever, but how do we build vitality, right? And so the experience that elsewhere and what's defined in the scenario matrix is this revitalisation and modernising the economy could be a very fruitful pathway, right? But it will require different thinking. Right? Require a different way to approach economic development, different types of businesses that would be here and so on. You're very strong, for example, if you look at the benchmark analysis, you're very strong in some areas like, food services sectors and construction and those type of things. Well, what are the other sort of economic categories that would be part of revitalisation and modernisation if that was occurring? The fourth one is fostering an inclusive multidimensional community. That's the horizontal axis. So that's the move from a destination community to a more inclusive, multi-generational community, multi-dimensional community. That's a really critical strategic pillar, and I think that's going to be very challenging to think about implementation going forward, because this is I don't know what you'd say. It's an expensive community. Most people would argue, a lot of what we heard is why we don't have a multi-dimensional community is because a lot of people who work here can't afford to live here. So if that's something you want, how do you achieve that? And I know the town, for example, is doing some affordable housing studies and things like that, but how do you retain or build a really multi-dimensional community? If that's something that's baked right into your visioning process, how do you accomplish that? That's a major strategic pillar. The next one around is building a connected and collaborative community fabric. And this one kind of starts to tilt to the future, right? So, and it's got two dimensions to it. So one is the physical connectivity and one is the behaviour of being connected sort of virtually and collaboratively. So if you look at, say, the first four pillars and the vision, that's going to require, I would argue, people to find the way to work together in different ways and be able to draw in resources and experts from all over the place to be able to solve your grand challenges. Okay? So to do that, you have to have platforms for dialogue and constructive thought and idea generation and execution and so on. So that's part of the sort of the connected, but in a sort of a virtual sense, but also the connected at the level of community fabric. One of the issues that was recurrent in the engagement sessions was this concern that there are these barriers to moving around the island, right? And because you have structures of gated communities, right, where you can't get in, right, unless you're either paying or you're invited. And the issue about that, and that's a really sensitive issue, and I understand that, right? So because that's tied up with people's perception of safety and what they came here for and so on, and we heard all that, and you can see that in the data. But I think what this is trying to tilt towards is, where is society going? You know, and what might have been appealing 10 years ago or 20 years ago or even today may be different as generations move through the system. So that was part of what certainly the think tank and some of the other younger kind of participants in the engagement session talked about, is that the fabric needs to evolve. You know, people want to be able to, younger people want to be able to socialise in different ways. You know, you can see the macro trends in movement towards neighbourhoods, or what we call community nodes in the report. You know, those spots where people come and connect, and it might be the coffee shop or the amenity centre or the recreation centre or the cultural centre, whatever they are. There are these points where people gather in a community, right? So there's an evolution to occur in that. The next one around is expanding to embrace an integrated regional focus, and this is interesting. And I know this community's been starting to look at that. It's a real pivot point, I think, because when this development first started here, there was really nothing between here and, you know, back whoop whoop on the road, right? Whereas today it's Hilton Head without the island almost all the way, right, to the interstate. So you've had a lot of this sort of concentration occurring around you, and you're no longer insulated or isolated as you once were. You know, your workforce is very inbound. Your infrastructure issues are tied into the regional landscape. But I think there's some really interesting opportunities here, right? Because if we look at the trends, you know, where agility and success is arriving is in large and regional consortiums, which can be towns and cities and communities coming together, that are able to adapt and grab hold of opportunities. Here, your big issues around workforce, transportation, infrastructure are going to require regional solutions. Your issues around macro changes in the environment, you know, weather patterns, threats of hurricanes, all those things, they're all tied up, you know, very intricately into a regional thing. So, we've proposed that if you get the trajectory right, you can become a really substantial player. I personally believe that you could position your island in an international level in terms of the next iteration of what it could be, right? And I want to talk about that, right? Then the last one, right, is the innovative approach to right-sized infrastructure, or to create right-sized infrastructure. That's the strategic pillar. The issue that's underpinning this is that infrastructure is embedded through everything. Everybody wants the problem fixed right now, okay? But the reality is, even if you said, we want to double the size of the bridge, how long does that take from, you know, planning, environmental approvals, funding cycles? It's like years away, right? And in that time frame, technology is going to change the game. So, for example, you know, what's the impact of autonomous vehicles? What's the impact of some of those type of changes that are coming down the system at us, right? So this concept of right-sized infrastructure is trying to think out forecasts, and how do you get, you know, rather than chase an infrastructure model that might have made sense 10 years ago, how do you chase an infrastructure model that makes sense in 10 years' time? And in fact, you can look at investment in mass transit type things. And in fact, many cities are doing things like saying, we don't want to tie up capital now in very expensive infrastructure because we think the story's going to change. Okay, so so I think that whole concept of this right-sized becomes really important, and it really ties into a lot of what we've talked about. All right, so they're the strategic pillars, right? And I've done as well as I can, I think, to try and explain where they came from and how they tie together. But these are overlapping and feed off each other and so on. But we've tried to cover the framework of the scenario planning, the overlying context of excellence, and then some of those key topics. In the report, these pillars are treated with several pages each, and we've tried to weave in all the, connect all the narrative we've heard in the engagement sessions to sort of, so you can find the place. So if you were talking about something in the engagement session or in one of the surveys, you'll find that located in one of these pillars. All right, and just to try and, in a very simple way, give you a diagrammatic representation, the way I would encourage you to think about this is that this is your machinery of the vision is going to be driven by these cogs, but they are not independent, right? So the systems type thinking ties all these strategic elements together in a very strong way. The issue with that is that if you have a missing cog, the machinery won't work. Okay, so I think to achieve the vision of reinventing sustainability again, you have to think about what are the fundamental things you need to have in play and make sure they happen concurrently. Because if you miss a key piece, then you may try really hard on others, but they may just not deliver the result that you're anticipating. All right, so now, underneath the strategic pillars, we've also, and I'm going to lead into a roadmap, right? So we tried to then surface up some subsets of key issues, right? And I'll move through this fairly fast and allocate them to sort of give a little bit more flavour. And then in the roadmap, I'll show you, we take these sort of subset big ideas or actions, right? Because we're now talking about the actions, and we sort of lay that out and say, well, how would that look in a 20-year time frame, and what sort of scale are we trying to work at? So if you take the relentless pursuit of excellence, we're talking about the island adopting the ideal of excellence, but doing it explicitly. I suspect it's implicit for a lot of people, right? But explicitly stating that that's what you're about. That's one of your defining metrics. In the longer term, I do believe that you have the opportunity to create yourself as an epicentre for excellence on a national and international scale. And I'll talk about what those opportunities are, I think, around some of your, how you work together as a community, some of your solutions to environmental issues, some of the issues around the cultural fabric and the Gullah Geechee community and its sort of future. I think all of those things are opportunities for you to be showcasing excellence that could be a model for other communities in the world and in this country. And I don't think it's audacious to say that, because that seems to be resonate with people, that there's a desire that that's who you want to be. You don't want to just be Myrtle Beach, or you want to be something better or different. So redefining the environmental sustainability. First step, redefine the sustainability. What do we mean by that? One of the issues that we've sort of pulled out is in a very practical way, is creating a renewable energy framework. I mean, that renewable energy, key driver, in a consumption society. I mean, you have enough, indigenous resources here to be at the forefront of that. And if you're going to be serious about sustainability, you've got to deal with that, right? That's just like, that's your table stakes. That's like, you don't get a seat at the table if you don't have a really decent renewable energy framework. There's also then the potential, I think, further down the track to become a location for unique environmental ecosystem research. You have a fascinating maritime, marine environment. You're a barrier island, and we know the issues about barrier islands. I think, and certainly it came through in the engagement processes and in the discussion, a lot of interest in this idea of how do you position yourself as the place where really interesting research and practical application occurs around what's part of your core value, and as a part of your vision is the environmental ecosystem research. So under the revitalising and modernising the economy, this is going to be, there's a balance point in this, right? Because you have a very big driver, which is tourism. 2.67 million people. It's been really the underpinning driver for a lot of the development here. If people are saying, well, we get sort of getting close to the limit of that and so on, and we don't want to just keep sort of running that, well, what are you going to do? Because you don't want to shoot yourself in your own foot. But people talked a lot about how might we be able to tap into different types of tourism and deepen and widen that tourism economy. To do that, you really need to understand what are the emergent tourism trends. Because we're getting to a point internationally where desirable locations for the first time are now starting to hit the point where they're actually ruining themselves. And you see now communities putting in measures to limit the number of people, for example. And that for the first time in history that occurred in a number of locations in Europe, the Cinque Terre and others, they're saying, we're putting a cap on the number of people because it's starting to destroy our own fabric here. So we're proposing that as a first step, and these actually run through sort of sequentially, and I'll lay this out in the roadmap. Focus on restoration and revitalisation sounds easy, but it's actually a fair bit more complex. But really thinking about how do you enable policies for redevelopment to occur that might be picking up some of these core values, different kinds of materials, environmental sustainability. If you're going to refurbish or revitalise, then do it so that it's meeting all the or ahead of all the current standards. But that, by the way, is a world of entrepreneurial activity. That's the opportunity for the maker culture, for craftsmen and artisans and small scale sort of business operators to come in and be part of driving economic restoration economy in the physical sense. Building the relevance to young professionals, really critical. We heard a lot about you're losing the game to Bluffton in terms of young professionals, businesses relocating. If you want to have a vibrant business sector, then you need to ensure you're relevant. And then further out, and this was further out because it was prioritised a little bit lower, but I think you have time on your side, is thinking about how do you really build your healthy ageing economy. We heard things in the engagement sessions about being able to build a really strong economy around active, healthy lifestyles and ageing. There's a lot of business opportunity in that as well. Next one, fostering an inclusive multi-generational community. Developing more mixed-use community nodes. There's sort of more the urgent need to provide or address affordable housing. That could be done through the redevelopment of some sort of node areas. These sort of community locations could be commercial areas going to mixed use and so on. I know there's some work being done by the town, but thinking about that sort of concept would be, I think, very potent. Obviously, educational options and lifelong learning and all the things that go with that are really important. A lot of appetite for building the diversity of recreational arts and quality of life offerings. Really thinking about, that ties to things like healthy ageing and sustainability. How do you really have, a much broader suite of these desirable recreational opportunities, and that ties in obviously to tourism opportunities and so on. And then creating yourself further out as a world-class active lifestyle and healthy ageing community. Who's going to be the community that's going to be the best place in the world to get old in? And that'd be kind of an interesting self-interest to have. And I really do think you have the potential, but I wouldn't underestimate how long that might take. But wouldn't that be consistent with the vision of reinventing human sustainability or community sustainability? Building a connected and collaborative community fabric, providing mechanisms for building trust. And I'll talk to this a little bit more at the end. I'm not sure if you have a relative sense of your community, but you have deep levels of distrust. Okay? And I'm saying that as somebody who really does care about and honours the interactions I've had with many people in this community. But I have been the one who stood in front of the 1,000 people and heard every version, okay? And there are divisions of trust between some of the different parts of the social fabric, and to call some out, obviously there are people in gated communities who feel threatened by, change, and you can see that in the data, right? But there's a distrust of where that might go. I've had the opportunity to talk to the Gullah Geechee community and heard firsthand with some passion some of their concerns about their existential crisis. You can play out a future where that cultural community becomes nothing more than a historic relic. or you can play out a different future, which is where they become an important and prosperous part of your story and your economy and your social fabric. But to get there, you have to have some functioning level of trust. And I'll be very interested as the fly on the wall to watch how the community starts to engage with some of the action areas, because that's where rubber hits the road. And that's where people are going to have to give a little, right? Those who don't want any change might just have to give a little bit. Those who want to race ahead and change the world may need to slow down a little bit and say, well, it's important that everybody come along on this journey. It's going to be important to say, well, if we do have some deep intergenerational, schisms, how do we continue to heal those? How do we build that, trust between, sections of our community? If you don't, you won't have any chance of fulfilling on what you see as your preferred future. Or some of you will experience that you've got it, but then others are going to be left behind. And truly a community is only as good as the people who are the most underserved or the most marginalised in the community. All right, so mechanisms of trust. And then the sort of more to the physicality, this nodes and modes concept of building that physical locations and connectivity. I think that could be, you have already demonstrated through, some great projects in bikeways and things like that, having different layers of connectivity in a community. So playing that out and saying, how do we tie all that together and build really parallel processes, that starts to solve your transportation or congestion issues and so on. That also builds a healthy, active lifestyle where people can have different ways to be mobile between different pockets of their community and so on. And then, of course, connecting to external stakeholders is, might seem a bit random there, but if you think about your community, 40,000 people, potentially an incredible vision, some really substantial grand challenges, that there are not textbook solutions that you can pull off the shelf. Imagine if you could be the laboratory where the best thinking in the world combines to solve some of the big issues. And in this community, more than any I've ever worked in, you have threads of contact to almost anybody you want. People came from all over this country. Many people who were very successful have very strong and intact personal networks and have some heft or some gravitas you could leverage by your external stakeholders. You could become that kind of focus for a lot of very interesting dialogue and thought. So then turning to the expanding and embracing the integrated regional focus, Bluffton's not really your competitor, right? I think as the region has grown, you have to think about how do you embrace them and be part of the fabric, right? That's the first step. The next one I talk about embracing this arc of innovation. One of the things we're noticing at a sort of a developed country world level is, well, one is we're having mass urbanisation. So increasingly people, particularly millennials and so on, are concentrating in large urban centres. And what that's creating, okay, you've got that experience, that downtown sort of intensity. But as you look at radiating circles around those metropolises, and take Savannah as one of them, right? Because it's becoming an attraction point for a lot of innovation and sort of in migration. As you look around those areas, then you're seeing a lot of innovation occurring in. That's where innovation in food processing, material assembly, distribution, all that's occurring in that arc of innovation. And I would say, well, how do you plug yourself in to be part of that? If you want to bring in the best and the brightest, start locally, right? So, but you've got to be tied into that system at the moment, not thinking like, oh well, they're way over there, and that's our airport, but we're never going to have anything else to do with them, right? And then, of course, to become a regional player. I think this community has the chance to be a substantial player at the table, but that means you have to have the credibility and the goods to be at the table. Then the last one, which is the right-sized infrastructure. The low-hanging fruit on this is some concept like an island-scale transportation system. Really take all of what we've just talked about, and how do you design over time like a local transportation system that jumps right ahead, right? Thinks about technology and where do we want to be in 5, 10, 20 and 40 years and so on. Then obviously there's a regional transportation system, and then the right-sized neighbourhood locations which we talked about. So that's that stuff, right? So roughly how we sort of laid this out in terms of a roadmap. Let me explain the structure of the diagram. Across the top are the 7 pillars. So I've had to revert to the linear sense, but we have the 7 pillars running across the top. Down the right-hand side, we have sort of like a logarithmic curve of time. So 2018, 19, 20, 25, 30, 40, right? And on the left-hand side, and it doesn't quite show up in this slide, but the background to that diagram is colour shaded, right? And it's picking up the local focus, the regional focus, and the international focus. So the idea here is, as you move forward on these key strategic pillars and build expertise and strength and so on, that's going to increase your capacity to have influence or to be reckoned with at different scales. The first thing you have to do is deal with your own local issues, right? And then obviously you can then start to say, well, let's think about our regional scale and then to our international scale. If you start at the international, the danger is you don't have the credibility to be there. You know, could you reasonably say right now that you're the epicenter for excellence on an international scale? No, it might be a wannabe, right? But you know, to get to that point, you've got to have some street creds. You know, you've got to have some things you can point to. And we can debate the sort of the scaling, but this is really sort of what we thought would be reasonable, because you know, you have only certain number of institutions able to execute. There's only a certain amount of resources, so you have to think about how do you do this in a logical sense. So the top bar there talks about 3 big kind of issues in the short term. One is adopting the ideal of excellence, and we'll talk a little bit, you know, how that could occur. The issue of redefining sustainability, and then creating the mechanisms to build trust. They're your sort of foundational building blocks, right? Low-hanging fruit, not expensive necessarily to do, but would require some, we're going to get our act together here and agree to some of these things, right? Or put in mechanisms for communication and collaboration. And then as you go down, you can see that we, you know, take those strategic action areas, the big ideas, and sort of lay these out on roadmaps. You might, I don't know, I'll be interested to hear your reaction. You may think some of this is lax ambition, because I'm sort of pegging out to 2030, things like creating yourself as the epicenter for excellence, healthy ageing economy, world-class active lifestyle and healthy ageing community in an international sense, right-sized neighbourhood locations. But I think those 12 years will fly by. So to get there, if you think about the logic of what you might need to do to get there, that's sort of laid out in that diagram. And obviously you'll be able to sort of investigate that in closer detail. In the shorter term, I think we thought it was really important to lay out a more sort of detailed or granular action plan. These are what we think sort of realistic things that would be the logical steps. On the very left-hand side, so you can see that I've got 2018, 19. The first extra column I put in here was the institutional steps. So there is a institutional process to follow. So obviously today is the first time everybody's getting their teeth into this. So the Vision Project Management team will need to review and, you know, consider and endorse or not the vision report. That obviously then needs to go to Town Council to adopt the vision report. And then that obviously needs to move through into actually what is your big opportunity here is the comprehensive planning process. So that's a really, you know, that has to happen anyway. So this is a great vehicle to be able to take some of this work and implement it. Then there's other anchor public institutions. So you start to move out into those. And then obviously the property owners associations, you know, becoming part of that, because I think, you know, you want to slowly wrap it all together. So that's the institutional pathway. Just very quickly across there, we're talking about, you know, the first one's the ideal, adopt the ideal of excellence, the redefining sustainability, and we've talked about that in detail in the report, right? But sort of pointed to some outcomes well. And then creating the mechanisms to trust. But then after that comes some of those next sort of future building things, which is sort of the deeper thinking and planning, and then sort of starts to move through to sort of triggering some more obvious actions in 2019, but it's aimed to tie into some of your planning mechanisms, such as comprehensive planning in the community. The big danger is, when I look at the prioritisation, everybody's very gung-ho about it. The danger is if you try and take on too much at once, you'll either crash the system, or you'll underfund things, or you'll race things, and a vision that's looking at 2040 is playing the long game.